Yeah, I can hear you.
Excellent. Thank you for agreeing to do the interview. I'm thrilled. It's a real honor for me.
Yeah, well, I always like talking, particularly about the JFK assassination, but other things too.
All right, wonderful. So welcome to the Andrew Paskin podcast. Today we're joined by eminent professor of political science at Marquette University, Professor John McAdams. How are you today, sir?
I'm doing well.
Excellent. Now, this podcast, the concept is I talk to intelligent people about certain crimes in their lives. Could be something small, could be something big. Now, with you, it's going to be one of the bigger end of the scale crimes, the JFK assassination. You're a world expert on that.
I don't want to be too immodest. I specialize more in teaching than I do about necessarily knowing everything or every bit of minutia. It's important on any issue like this to figure out what the key issues are and what the reliable evidence is. And a lot of stuff can sort of be dismissed because whether it's true or not, it doesn't matter very much, or the source is so unreliable, you can never know whether it's true. So I try to be at least moderately modest about what I know. Otherwise, I'll be found out.
I've always admired that about you. I've been following your work since I was a younger man, and I've admired the way that you can be so polite with these aggressive, irrational conspiracy types. It's almost infantile, and you always have a high road approach. Like, if that was me, I'd be just straight off the deep end immediately.
Well, I think in a lot of cases, people's attitudes toward the assassination involve sort of hostility to various things, the establishment, the American politics and how it operates, the political right in many cases, in somewhat fewer cases, but still a substantial number, the political left. And so it's a way of expressing that kind of hostility.
Now, your book you wrote, JFK Assassination Logic, How to Think About Claims of a Conspiracy, it's the same attitude throughout the whole book. Now, the opening paragraph for me is just sets the tone perfectly. I'll read that for the listeners. This is not a book telling you what to think about conspiracy theories. Instead, it provides advice on how to think about conspiracy theories.
Essentially, I try to basically write about how to evaluate evidence. And, for example, some evidence is more reliable than others. So base your theories on the reliable evidence. Physical evidence, assuming it hasn't been tampered with, and of course, you'll get all kinds of claims of tampering, by the way, which can be adjudicated scientifically, but if physical evidence hasn't been tampered with, it's way more reliable than witness testimony. So if the witness testimony says one thing, but say autopsy photos and x-rays that have been thoroughly examined by top experts and found to be authentic say something else, you go with the photos and x-rays. Another principle is you sometimes have to ask, what would be the point if someone says, well, the conspiracy did this or the conspiracy did that? You might ask the question, why would they do that? For example, there's a long, long list of so-called mysterious deaths of people supposedly who had some kind of knowledge dangerous to the conspiracy who died under quote-unquote mysterious circumstances. Let's leave aside for the moment the fact that in most cases the circumstances weren't at all mysterious. Well, you have to ask, well, why would they kill that particular person? In many cases, there's essentially zero evidence that the person actually could have known anything dangerous to the conspiracy, like one of the famous lists of mysterious deaths from author Jim Marrs has the death of the chief steward on Air Force One, that's the president's plane, dying.
Yeah. Now
you have to ask, were there people on Air Force One plotting a conspiracy and he overheard them? I mean, do you plot a conspiracy to kill the president on Air Force One? Otherwise, what did he know? The mayor of New Orleans, for example, is on that same list. What was the connection there? Well, Lee Harvey Oswald lived in New Orleans, like several 100,000 other people, and that was the only connection. Not Marr's list, but there's a book called Hit List by a guy named Bowser, who lists as a mysterious death a country singer named Jim Reeves, who was talking to some of his friends about how they might have been a conspiracy, and then he died in a plane crash. which I suppose a conspiracy could arrange a plane crash. But what would a country singer know about that? And, how many people at various times have talked to somebody else about how they thought there was a conspiracy? Quite a lot of them. So in many cases, you have to ask, why in the world would any conspiracy bother killing Jim Reeves or the mayor of New Orleans? So you have to ask questions like that. And when you ask questions like that, you end up with a relatively small body of evidence. I say relatively small, relative to the total bulk of things mentioned in the average conspiracy book. Now, if there was a conspiracy, the evidence is going to need to be somewhere in that small body of reliable evidence that remains when you, in effect, toss out stuff that's clearly bogus.
Well, Jim Reeves probably went because the conspirators realized country music was 3 chords on the truth, and they thought that was a worry. George Jones was next on the list, but he survived.
Oh, yeah.
The tenuous links of these conspiracies is what gets me every time. But now, I first saw JFK by Oliver Stone when I was like 11 or 12. I think it was 12 maybe. And it blew me away. It was the most amazing filmmaking I've ever seen. And I was hook, line, and sinker on the Oliver Stone, Jim Garrison conspiracy. And then I wrote to you like an arrogant young man and said, there was no tone in the email, but it would have sounded something like this if there was. Why can't you explain Eladio del Valle to me? And then you concisely explained it in about 1.5 sentences and shut me down politely. And I started reading all your work and going through your website and got your book, and it changed my whole way of thinking about conspiracy. And you saved me a lot of time, Professor, over the years.
I'm always glad to hear people who've read my book and looked at my website and corresponded with me.
I'll give the address for the listeners because I recommend everybody goes to this site and just has a look around. And if you're going to write emails to Professor McAdams, don't do that. And do not at me on Twitter because I don't want to hear from you conspiracy nuts. I'm not as polite as the professor. Go and search it on this website first because you've got a wonderful search index function for everything on your site, but also related sites with JFK material. So you could find out the actual facts on what you're looking for and read it and make your own conclusions. So the address for this site is McAdams, MCADAMS .posc.mu.edu.
Yep.
But yeah, it's a wonderful resource. I recommend the book as well. The book's far more in depth in the psychology of conspiracy theories and, like you said, the value of certain types of evidence and false memories and all the rest of it. And that's JFK Assassination Logic, How to Think About the Claims of Conspiracy. I just rebought it off Amazon on Kindle. So yeah, I recommend both of those.
They can also go to jfkassassination.net. It will land them at the same place.
I didn't know that.
If it's easier to remember, jfkassassination.net, that'll get you there. Same place.
I've spent hours on that site. It's so interesting. And it's not, again, trying to convince you to think one way. It's the hard evidence laid out for you to read. What came across in my mind was, as I'm preparing for this interview, is that my interviewing style is very much similar to a conspiracy theorist, where I have a cursory understanding of the subject matter and just enough points to sound like I know what I'm talking about and confound the listener. Now, that's exactly what conspiracy theorists do. I'm interested in your thought on the psychology of a conspiracy theorist. I've read a whole bunch of stuff, journals and what have you, and the common public conception is that it's a fear of the randomness of the universe and you want to have some control. Is that something you subscribe to?
Well, yeah, I can. Although I'm slightly hesitant to talk about that because it sort of becomes a bit of an argumentum ad hominem, Well, those crazy people believe that because of whatever. On the other hand, this is an arcane argument from freshman logic. An argumentum ad hominem is a reasonable response to an argumentum ad populum. That is to say, people says, that must be true because a lot of people believe it. Well, then if you can turn around and explain why a lot of people might believe it, irrespective of whether it's true or not, that's a reasonable response, although neither can actually trump the evidence. There's a lot to peel back in terms of that onion. The sort of grossest look at it would say that conspiracy theories are ways of expressing hostility toward people whom you don't like, often for political reasons. For example, where JFK conspiracy theories are concerned, for the most part, they come from the political left. Now, I say for the most part, if you look at most books, etc., out there in the real world, there are plenty of people who want to blame Castro. The John Birch Society, actually, in the wake of the assassination, put out little stickers you could put on your envelope when you sent out the mail, which said, "Communism killed Kennedy." But, if you pretty much don't like the CIA, don't like the military-industrial complex, don't like anti-Castro Cubans, then you might want to blame them for the JFK assassination. Conspiracy theories coming from the left also applies to 9/11 truthers. That is, people who believe that, George W. Bush or maybe Dick Cheney arranged the 9/11 attacks. Those typically come from the political left. On the other hand, the birther conspiracy, that is the idea that Barack Obama wasn't really qualified to be president of the United States because he was born in Kenya, typically came from the political right. At one point, it was embraced by our president, Donald Trump. And, of course, other conspiracy theories have come from the political right. Anytime someone fusses and fumes about the so-called New World Order, I've never been able to figure out exactly what that is, except that it must be terribly powerful because they're always talking about it. They tend to come from the political right. So that is the first cut, which is simple partisan politics. Now, what you alluded to is the fact that it's well established in psychology that people have a need for understanding. They like to believe that they understand what's going on and what's happening. That means that people don't particularly like randomness. They don't like the idea that by a sheer long shot chance, this left-wing malcontent happened to get a job in the Texas School Book Depository overlooking the motorcade route in Dallas and shot Kennedy for reasons that aren't entirely clear. By the way, lone assassin people have never come up with a single clear explanation of Oswald's motivations, although there's some, reasonable thoughts on that. But by the way, it's not necessarily the case that we should be able to, since, there's a field called abnormal psychology. You can take courses in abnormal psychology, and the whole point of abnormal psychology is it's not the way normal people think. So it's not necessarily the case that we should have to come up with a coherent account of why Oswald did it. Still, it's unsatisfying if we can't come up with a coherent account of why Oswald did it. On the other hand, if you believe the military-industrial complex did it because Kennedy was going to withdraw from Vietnam, that's easy to fathom. That's easy to understand. And I think it's also true that people would almost rather believe that evil people are in control than to believe that nobody's in control. And of course,
that's the key point.
In any democracy, the unfortunate truth is quite often nobody's really in control. Actually, that's almost one of the characteristics of democracy. So if people find it more comforting to believe that certain people are in control and they can fathom their motives than to believe that something that was pretty much random happened, that for no good reason history changed substantially. And by the way, it's easy to believe that history changed radically because, people would like to believe that the morass that was Vietnam wouldn't have happened if Kennedy had lived, or if all of the turmoil of the 60s wouldn't have happened if we'd had John Kennedy as a leader. None of that is clear at all. In fact, I think it's probably implausible, but it's sort of nice to believe that history went wrong because of this event, and it went wrong because of bad people making it go wrong. So now, having said that, it's important to understand that even badly motivated people can have the evidence on their side sometime. So this is entirely different from talking about the evidence in the assassination. But remember, conspiracy theorists like to portray lone assassin theorists as sort of sheep who will just believe anything the government says. If you know anything about American politics, you know almost nobody on the left or on the right particularly believes whatever the government says. I wouldn't be surprised if it's pretty similar in Australia and democracies generally. But, so you can come up with theories on both sides about how there's a problem with the psychology of people on the other side.
It's interesting because, in Australia, I'm around a lot of sort of low-level comedians, and there seems to be a direct link between poor intellects and high levels of narcissism that we have, and obviously cannabis use. So there's a lot of conspiracies around me. But it's easy just to say it's all for dummies. But there's some very intelligent people that are on conspiracy bents, like G. Robert Blakey, the author of the RICO Law, law professor at Notre Dame. He was on the House Select Senate Committee for the assassination. He's now a conspiracy believer.
Well, first of all, in fairness to Blakey, he does not overstate the case. You can watch him in various videos saying, if there was a conspiracy, I think he inclines to believing it was, it probably involves the mafia. He doesn't go around promiscuously adopting, every bit of conspiracy nonsense. In fact, the House Select Committee on Assassinations in the 1970s, he was the chief staff person, debunked a huge amount of conspiracy nonsense. But being very smart doesn't necessarily mean you're right about everything. I mean, how many eminent intellectuals have there been who were wrong about this or that? Even eminent intellectuals who were right about lots of things, but were sort of wrong about one thing that was sort of their obsession. I mean, immediately you think of a guy named William Shockley, who was the inventor of the transistor, but then became a racist theorist.
Right.
He was plenty smart enough, and he was he was great when he was just dealing with microcircuits. During the 20th century, how many very smart intellectuals were either Marxists, quite a good number, or a not trivial number who were, look at the 1920s and 30s, supporters of fascism and even the Nazi movement. So being smart doesn't make you immune to adopting theories that people like you and me would say, no, that doesn't make a lot of sense. That's not very smart at all. But
what blows me away about G. Robert Blakey is last week on the podcast I had George Anastasia, one of the top 2 mafia experts in the world in US mafia. I didn't even bring up the JFK assassination because it's too laughable. For him to subscribe to that, to me, is unbelievable, given that he sat on the committee. Anyway, but I mean, it's not for me to say, but the one thing I wanted to bring up, which I think is a really, really important part of conspiracy debunking now, is the Beyond Conspiracy documentary on ABC television in 2003 that Peter Jennings hosted documentary. Did you catch that?
Yeah, I've looked at large parts of it. I don't remember whether I've actually watched it beginning to end. I show my students the Dale Myers 3D simulations of the single bullet theory.
Well, the Dale Myers 3D thing is what I'm getting at. I mean, the whole thing's presented in the same manner you present your work. It's, here's the evidence, make your own conclusions. But he recreated on a computer program, a CAD drawing thing or something, based on the Zapruder film, a 3D animation of the whole of Daley Plaza, so you can go to any angle and see what's happening. And if that can't be debunked, that computer animation, that rules out every single grassy knoll conspiracy theory, does it not?
Not exactly, because it could have been a shooter in the depository and a shooter in the grassy knoll. And the Blakey and the House Select Committee believed, based on supposed acoustic evidence, that there was a shooter on the grassy knoll, by the way, that fired a shot that missed, and a shooter, who they believed it was Lee Oswald, in the depository shooting at Kennedy and shooting all the bullets that hit Kennedy.
So, sorry, the grassy knoll one is supposedly a missed shot.
The House Select Committee said that, yeah. Most conspiracists believe that the bullet that hit Kennedy in the head was fired from the grassy knoll. The House Select Committee had a different view because they took seriously the medical evidence, and the medical evidence clearly showed that every bullet that hit Kennedy hit him from behind. Yeah, that animation was a very a good animation. It's not the only one by any means. An operation called Failure Analysis Associates in the early 1990s did a 3D computer animation, and it showed that the single bullet trajectory worked. Nova did in 1988 a rather crude. I mean, remember, go back that far in computer animation is a bit crude.
Yeah.
That showed the single bullet theory worked. You can criticize those animations. The people who criticize them will say, well, garbage in, garbage out. They're only as good as the data you put in. Just looking at pictures of the motorcade, however, you can clearly see that Connolly is inboard of Kennedy by several inches. He's not, as the Oliver Stone trajectory, in the courtroom in the movie JFK showed him directly in front. He's well inboard. He's below about 3 inches in terms of head height. And you can see in the Zapruder film that hearing a shot from over his right shoulder, Connolly turns his torso around to the right. Well, first of all, he turns his head pretty sharply, then he turns his torso around, and he's trying to see Kennedy, seeing if Kennedy's okay. And when you put all those things together, it's pretty obvious that, yeah, the single bullet trajectory is possible. In all fairness, those animations might not rule out a shot from some other place behind and to the right of Kennedy and Connolly, although there's no really good candidate about where that might be. That might be the upper floors of the Daltex building, but nobody seems to claim that. So there's something called an error cone in these models because, well, anytime you estimate things like, you look at a film and you estimate distances, well, there's possibly some error. So there's not enough precision to say the shot came from the sniper's nest window. There is enough to say it came from the sniper's nest window or a cone that might have been 10 yards wide, centered on the sniper's nest window. Or maybe not centered, maybe a little off center, but still the sniper's nest window was in the cone. So quick way of putting it would be that those simulations show that the single bullet trajectory was possible. They don't absolutely show that it was necessary, but again, if it wasn't from the sniper's nest window, where was it? There are multiple witnesses who saw a shooter in the sniper's nest window.
Yeah.
So where did it come from? So you put it all together and, yeah.
Now, before we get into the Garrison Oliver Stone debacle, the point you raised about the dictaphone with the House Select Committee. Now, to me, the most unbelievable thing about that was that it wasn't thoroughly checked enough to not get the wrong answer. So they've come out and said it's a probable conspiracy in the JFK assassination was their findings based on this dictaphone evidence, and then later on had to overturn it. Now, how embarrassing can you get?
Yeah.
That's done more damage than anything, perhaps even more than the movie, that House Select Committee.
Yeah, that proves something a little disturbing about science, okay? Not all science is equal. There's a website at the University of Washington, let's talk about coronavirus for a minute, that predicts what's going to happen in every country in the world and in every U.S. state and in various provinces and countries in Europe where their data is available in terms of how many cases of coronavirus are going to be, what are going to be demands on ICU beds and invasive ventilators, and how many people are going to die. For a long time, they were predicting that the virus would be essentially gone in Wisconsin by the middle of May. Well, I'm sitting here and the virus is not gone. In fact, we've just had the largest number of new confirmed cases of at any point in the epidemic. Now, a key thing here, confirmed cases can be a function not only of how many people have the virus, but how much testing you're doing. Because if you do a lot of testing, you're getting more confirmed cases. But it turns out the science on that wasn't terribly exact. So not all science is terribly exact. That's particularly the case when you have people who are on the forefront of a given field. And in the 1970s, it was academics who were into acoustic analysis. When you're on the forefront of a particular field and you have something to prove, that is to say, you want to legitimate your particular area of inquiry. You want to prove that you can prove important things. So there's science and there's science. The most reliable science is science that's been around for decades, survived extensive peer review. For example, the science that will match a bullet, for example, Commission Exhibit 399, the so-called magic bullet, to Oswald's rifle, that science, even in 1963, had been around for decades, survived extensive peer review, had held up in court. And remember, when you use evidence like that in court to try to convict somebody, you've got a defense lawyer perfectly capable of calling experts to challenge that evidence. Yeah, you can believe that. But if it's a sort of a brand new area of inquiry and the people involved in it have something to prove, it can be a bit questionable. And in this particular case, it did not survive peer review on the part of eminent scientists in something called the Ramsey panel. There is some, by the way, what I call buff forensics on the lone assassin side. One theory, for example, about why Kennedy's head went back into the left, as it was a so-called jet effect. That is, the brain matter ejected forward, pushed his head back into the left. The problem is with that is not only does his head go back into the left, his whole body spasms and goes back to the left. So it was almost certainly not the jet effect, but a neuromuscular spasm, because a bullet hits the brain, neurons fire, and the muscles contract. The House Select Committee actually looked at a video of a goat being shot in the head, and its back muscles contracted and its legs splayed out. So you do get what I call buff forensics on both sides.
There's a video game that got banned years ago called JFK Reloaded, where you can reenact the assassination and you can shoot and see if you can do the 3 shots in the time and all the rest of it, right? But what it does show you is that this game, you can see it on YouTube, JFK Reloaded. What it does show is the actual distances and how easy it is really to pull it off if you got lucky. But it shows the angle of how you're shooting at JFK's head. He's sort of coming down towards the back and the side of his head, so it's going to push left. It's not going to go directly straight.
Yeah, and although some people contested this, his head did seem to move forward by a couple of inches between Zapruder frame 312 and 313 before it explodes, as though a bullet hitting the back of his head might have pushed it forward a little bit. People will disagree about what that is. That was the conclusion of a firm called iTech, a photo analysis firm in the middle 1970s, and they actually had the original Zapruder film to work with. So it's worth working out the angles, and in general, when you work out the angles, you find that, the trajectory from the school book depository does work. That's not a deal breaker. A shooter in the sniper's nest, and again, multiple witnesses saw a shooter in the sniper's nest. Well, I say they saw a shooter. They saw a shooter or a gun being withdrawn from the window, which is about the same thing. So given the overwhelming witness testimony, including, by the way, 2 guys on the 5th floor right below the sniper's nest who heard shots that they recognized from overhead, and one of them, named Harold Norman, actually heard a cycling of the mechanism and spent cartridges dropping on the floor. By the way, it was an old warehouse. There was no carpet on the floor. There were, cracks between the floorboards. It was perfectly possible he heard that. And then you get Harold Norman and his buddy, Bonnie Ray Williams. Multiple witnesses in the wake of the shooting saw those 2 guys. Of course, they didn't know their name. They just said 2 Negroes or 2 colored men looking out the window, looking directly up. Absolutely clear evidence that at the time they believed the shots came from overhead. And as ear witnesses go, they were absolutely closest to the sniper's nest.
Yeah, I mean, I implore everybody to watch Beyond Conspiracy, to go to your website and go through all the facts, because it's all there for everyone to read. But Let's get on to the Holy Grail, Professor, the JFK movie. Now, this has done more damage to this conspiracy than anything else. Oliver Stone should hang his head in shame for making one of the greatest films ever made based on complete BS. Excuse my French, but my favorite page on your entire website is the /JFK movie subpage. Now, this has got over 50 factoids from the movie that Oliver Stone produced and the evidence that debunks them. So what's your relationship with Oliver Stone? Have you met him?
No, I haven't.
I don't think he would like to meet you.
And I haven't been particularly desirous of doing so.
I bet. Now, he's obviously a genius filmmaker, which again, to the G. Robert Blakey thing, it doesn't mean you have to be a dummy to be a conspiracy nut. So this film, to me, is one of the all-time classics, and it broke my heart when I realized it was rubbish.
Yeah. Creative people don't have to be very good at processing information. Years ago, on rock radio in the U.S., there was a rock line where they would interview various famous rock musicians. And it was interesting to find out that these guys, for the most part, weren't terribly smart. But they were making great music. It's just, if you ask them to actually analyze information or something, they weren't that bright. They were just, in fact, immensely talented in certain ways.
It was like Spinal Tap, was it?
So I think that's a general principle. Having a sort of cold, analytic mind might actually stand in the way of creativity in certain ways. At least that's possible. So maybe we should be happy that very talented rock musicians who you would assume their political opinions are probably nonsensical, but they make great music, exist in the world. And other people who can analyze data and come up with a sound conclusion.
Now, Oliver Stone's film JFK is based primarily on the book On the Trail of the Assassins by Jim Garrison, and Kevin Costner plays Jim Garrison in the film. Is that the basis of it?
Well, yeah, and also Jim Marr's book Crossfire. Both are credited. Right. You can actually find online the original shooting script with citations. There's a citation for everything in the film to a book. Of course, I'm sure you understand that if you go find a Holocaust denial essay somewhere, you can probably find one that also has lots of citations. Anyway, the citations are not going to be particularly reliable historical treatments. Same thing with the movie JFK. But it was heavily enough based on Marr's book and on Jim Garrison's book that, those two books were credited.
So the broad strokes version of their theory seems to be that it was the anti-Castro militant groups in conjunction with the government agencies and the military-industrial complex combined with links to the homosexual underworld, and that's the conspiracy.
Time magazine, when they critiqued the film, said, you want to know who shot JFK? The anti-Castro Cubans, the CIA, the military-industrial complex, blah, blah. Sort of everybody shot at JFK. Well, everybody except Lee Harvey Oswald. This is a common defect in conspiracy literature. The evidence against the CIA is about as good as the evidence against the military-industrial complex, which is about as good as the evidence against the Pentagon, which is about as good as the evidence against Texas oil millionaires, which is about as good as the evidence against anti-Castro Cubans. And none of it is much good. So you sort of throw it all together without asking, could all of those people really have been involved and nothing leaked out?
Well, I think one of the lines out of the movie, which was one of the funniest ones for me looking back, is he's saying all the people involved, and then Bill Broussard, the character from his team, says, well, I believe the mob. And he goes, I don't doubt the mob was involved, Bill, but to a lesser degree. So he's chucked the mob in as an extra piece.
Interestingly, the House Select Committee on Assassinations interviewed Jim Garrison, and he claimed not to know that Carlos Marcello was a mobster.
from New Orleans.
I have a chapter in my book, which is how to come up with a conspiracy theory that's not insane. And, of course, the first principle has to be, it has to be a relatively small number of people. The more people you include in your conspiracy theory, the more likely something will have leaked out. Now, conspiracy theorists will say, well, yes, a lot of stuff leaked out because all these people have come forward claiming to have been part of a conspiracy or known something about a conspiracy. The problem is they all have credibility problems, and they all tell different stories. Their stories contradict each other. So if somebody wants to say, well, a small group of rogue CIA agents arranged to assassinate Kennedy and somehow manipulated Lee Oswald into doing it, that's not utterly insane.
Plausible.
I don't think it happened, but it's not utterly insane. Or some left-wingers that Oswald somehow had a connection with that we haven't learned about talked to Oswald and said, look, Kennedy's trying to get rid of Castro. Oswald may have gotten wind of assassination plots that might have happened because Castro made a comment to an Associated Press reporter to the effect, hey, if you keep plotting against me, that might backfire. And that was reprinted from the Associated Press in New Orleans newspapers when Oswald was there. We don't know for sure that he read that. We know he read leftist journals, The Worker and the Militant, ironically a Stalinist paper and a Trotskyist paper. That tells you something about Oswald's ideological sophistication because, of course, Stalinists and Trotskyists hate each other, but he certainly would have learned from those papers the hostility of the JFK administration toward Castro. So did some left-wingers sort of talk to Oswald and say, Kennedy's a real threat to the revolution, blah, blah, et cetera, and maybe even offered to pick him up after he shot Kennedy. That's not absurd. I don't think it happened, but it's not absurd. I mean, that's a problem with the mysterious deaths list. It has people from the Mafia, the CIA, the FBI, the anti-Castro Cubans.
Well, the one I wanted to ask you about, Professor, was the Eladio Del Valle one, the one that I obnoxiously wrote to you about many years ago.
Yeah.
This guy was a former Cuban congressman, part of the Bay of Pigs invasion, anti-Castro militant, involved reputedly in drug trafficking with Centro Traficante in Florida, and he was murdered, right, close to the date of Dave Ferry's death.
Yeah, he was indeed murdered, yeah.
So if you know anything about the drug trade and also the anti-Castro groups who are murdering each other based on power struggles and certain groups like Omega 7 not thinking they were anti-Castro enough so they killed people, the guy might have had a long lifespan anyway.
Yeah. And by the way, the only source that makes a connection between Del Valle and David Ferry is a fellow who gave the account to the National Enquirer. I don't know if people in Australia have heard of the National Enquirer.
We know about it, yeah.
But it's a tabloid. That was the outlet that published the famous theory that Ted Cruz's dad was on the street near Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans when Oswald was handing out his pro-Castro pamphlets. They don't have a good reputation for reliability. So there really isn't any solid evidence, even linking Del Valle to David Ferry. So, yeah, but you have all these people from these different groups that died. Either they were all involved, or the vast majority of them could have had nothing to do whatsoever with the JFK assassination. In fairness to someone like Robert Blakey, he blames the mafia. He doesn't blame everybody else. But people like Jim Marrs will throw everything against the wall and hope something sticks.
Well, I mean, the mysterious death, in inverted commas, of Lee Bowers.
Yeah.
He died in a single car accident. How mysterious.
Yeah. People die in car accidents, for heaven's sakes. And if you look at the specifics of a lot of these deaths, I mean, it sounds mysterious when you don't know what happened, right? Well, they died mysteriously. And then you research it, as a lot of my students have done in my class, and find out it's not mysterious at all. Like Dorothy Kilgallen, who was a columnist for the Journal American in New York, who claimed she was going to blow open the case. There's no actual evidence that she did blow open the case. And if she had, it would be odd that she didn't just publish her findings in her column, for heaven's sakes. If you really have the goods on a conspiracy and you're a journalist, hey, you want to publish it. But anyway, she was found dead in her bedroom at her apartment, and the cops and then the medical examiner went in, and they said, there were no signs of violence. And the toxicology came back with moderately elevated ethanol in her blood. She'd had a few drinks, not many necessarily, and moderately elevated barbiturates in her blood. Now, I trust high schoolers in Australia, and for that matter, high schoolers in the U.S. are told, don't mix alcohol and barbiturates. It's deadly.
If you Google a list of actors and actresses that have died in the 50s and 60s, there'll be about 150 died of barbiturates overdoses.
Yeah.
But,
yeah. And this wasn't even an overdose per se. It was just she apparently got careless about having a drink or two and then taking some sleeping pills. Yeah.
The conspiracy answer to this death was that she was sitting in bed with the wrong reading glasses on, reading a book she'd already read. That was the smoking gun.
Actually, sitting at my bedside right now is a couple of books I've already read and might want to go back to. That's the level of, I think it in fact was a townhouse on the affluent east side of Manhattan, and her son and husband were in the same unit in different bedrooms. Remember, she was up very late, completing her column for the next day for the Journal American. And so she apparently sort of had her own bedroom so she could get the column and get to sleep very, very late.
Right.
But did somebody just break in, sneak in? It would be like somebody breaking in your house and murdering somebody in one bedroom and just risking that the people in the other bedrooms would never hear anything or see anything.
Absolutely. Now, the one thing that blew me away reading your material was about Perry Russo. Now, the whole Garrison Stone theory is based on this Clay Shaw homosexual underworld CIA link conspiracy. Now, when I read the facts on this Perry Russo, which is the main basis of the Kevin Bacon, Willie O'Keefe character, hilarious character, mind you, like Jim Garrison's defrauded people by carrying on with this, really.
Yeah. The interesting thing about Perry Raymond Russo is we know what he was saying early on. He talked to the Baton Rouge, Louisiana newspapers. I got his original interviews from a nice lady at one of the papers who actually looked into a hard copy folder and pulled out and copied the old article. This was before, sort of everything got put in a database. He early on was talking about knowing David Ferry. He did know David Ferry. And Ferry talking about how it would be possible to kill the president. I don't remember saying anything about Ferry wanting to kill the president or advocating killing the president. It just Ferry was talking about how it was possible, which is plausible enough. I mean, David Ferry would BS. Lots of people. Some people actually thought he was brilliant or something. But that's all he was saying initially to Baton Rouge newspapers. Then a guy named Andrew Chambra, his nickname was Moo Chambra. It's a shame people don't have nicknames anymore, but in that era, people would have nicknames. So this was Moo Chambra, right? Went to Baton Rouge to interview him, and Russo repeated that. And then Russo showed him a picture of Clay Shaw and asked if he'd ever seen Clay Shaw. Well, then Russo mentioned twice he'd seen Clay Shaw. Once was talking to David Ferry in a car at a gas station. The other was a public event in New Orleans. Russo portrayed Shaw as being overtly homosexual, somebody staring at a young boy's genitalia, by the way, which would not fit Shaw's behavior at all. But he mentioned seeing Shaw twice, but nothing about Shaw even discussing killing Kennedy. So anyway, he's brought to New Orleans, Perry Raymond Russo is, and given sodium pentothal, which supposedly is a truth serum. Of course, it's not a truth serum. It might be called a truth serum because you inject somebody with it and you reduce their inhibitions, which theoretically might mean that they'd be more willing to tell the truth. Unfortunately, people have inhibitions about saying things that aren't true, and it would reduce those inhibitions too,
I actually researched it a bit. Apparently it's a barbiturate itself. So.
Yeah. Anyway, they got a little bit of a assassination party there, but no mention of Shaw in any way taking part in it. There was some talk about, well, Kennedy's going to be killed, and then Russo's asked, well, who's going to do it? He said, well, I guess the people there. Then he's 3 times put under hypnosis, and He's put under hypnosis and questioned with a very large degree of suggestion, like the fellow who does it, who's a physician with no expertise in forensic use of hypnosis, says, now, there's a white-headed man sitting over, a very distinguished-looking man, I'm paraphrasing a little, sitting over there. This is, Rousseau has talked about a meeting. Would you describe it? And then Rousseau proceeds to talk about a Clem Bertrand, not Clay, but Clem Bertrand. And if memory serves, this is all on my website, the doctor is named Fatter, says, well, they're talking about assassinating someone.
Yeah.
The key thing about hypnosis is that it's a state of heightened suggestibility. Someone under hypnosis will pretty much, with some limits, but very loose limits, accept what you tell them. So basically, he is subjected to very leading testimony and then eventually describes Ferry and Lee Oswald and Clay Shaw discussing assassinating Kennedy. But the testimony has been produced under sodium pentothal and hypnosis. A key thing about hypnosis is this. You might think that when someone says something when they're hypnotized and brought out of hypnosis that, boom, they would forget it. That's not true. It's possible to implant memories via hypnosis. Hypnosis sometimes can have a legitimate forensic use, but only as a way of establishing leads. For example, somebody under hypnosis might be able to recall the color, appearance, maybe even the make and model, if they know a lot about cars, of a car involved in, let's say, a hit and run, okay? That might be a useful lead to try to go out and look for somebody who owns a similar car. It could never be evidence at a trial. So this was essentially just a huge abuse of hypnosis. Happily, the Chambre memo had leaked. Garrison, somehow ignorant of what it really showed, gave it to a journalist named James Phelan, who was skeptical of the whole enterprise, who gave it to Shaw's defense. And at trial, this was completely blown out of the water. It was basically shown to the jury that no, in his early interviews, Rousseau said nothing about any assassination party and nothing about Shaw being involved in any discussion of an assassination.
Well, I mean, even more damning than this ridiculous charade you've just described there of coaxing this fanciful story out of him, he was doing lie detector tests, which themselves are no prize either, but he kept failing them, and he admitted to the person running the test that the story wasn't true. He couldn't answer truthfully because it wasn't true.
Yeah. Rousseau said different things to different people, and to several people, including James Phelan. He sort of confessed that he wasn't really sure about any of that, but he was scared to retract his story because he knew Garrison would charge him with perjury if he did. So the guy was trapped. I don't have any sympathy for him, though. He was just way too willing to cooperate. Yeah,
but the fact that the whole thing's based on that is just insane to me. The last part about the JFK movie, which is kind of humorous, but again, it's done more damage than maybe anything, is the Mr. X character, the L. Fletcher Prouty-based character played by Donald Sutherland so brilliantly in the film. So that's linking the military-industrial complex to the whole thing, from Stone's point of view.
Yeah, Prouty has said all kinds of, shall we say, interesting things in his book. He says that a group called the High Cabal, which is transnational, I mean, they rule the whole world, behind the scenes manipulating things. He actually believes, based on what a harbor master, and I think it was Guam, told him at the end of World War II, that both the Korean War and the Vietnam War were being planned at the end of World War II by the High Cabal. He believes that oil is not a fossil fuel, he's passed away, that oil was not a fossil fuel. He believed that Francis Gary Powers' U-2 was not shot down by the Soviets, that it just landed. He, at one point, said that the High Cabal might have killed Princess Diana. He was kind of cozy with the Scientologists and the LaRouche group. I think not because he sort of believed in Scientology or any of the LaRouche nonsense. He would just talk to anybody who would pay rapt attention to what he said and tell them sort of the kind of things they wanted to hear. So he's not a reliable source at all.
So yet again, you've displayed your class there, and to give him an easy run there, I'm going to say that he's off his head, and the fact that Donald Sutherland played it so perfectly. Like when I was a kid, I believed every word he said. I was like, yes, that makes sense, Donald Sutherland. But this guy's had more conspiracies per year than anyone alive, I think. Prouty.
Yeah.
But wonderful stuff on the JFK assassination. I'm going to leave all the links for your materials there for the listeners, but your career as a professor, you've been to 3 universities, which blows me away. So you grew up in Alabama, right?
Correct. At a little town called Kennedy, Alabama.
Oh, my God.
Population of 375 when I was there. Nice hilly country. So I went to a little high school that had like 300 people, grades 1 through 12 there. Then I went off to Columbia Teachers College because I wanted to be a teacher, got a master's in social studies education. And that convinced me I didn't really want to be a high school teacher. I wanted to be a college professor. So I went to Harvard and got a PhD in political science and got hired right out of graduate school by Marquette University.
Did you go to University of Alabama?
Yeah, that was my undergraduate work from 1964 to 1968.
In which area?
I majored in sociology.
Oh, wow.
The introductory courses were very good. The upper division courses I didn't care for, but I was already sort of committed to a major. So I guess by the time I finished, I decided any more graduate work I did, I was going to be in political science, not sociology.
Now, the biggest question of this podcast is going to be, are you a Crimson Tide fan or a Harvard Crimson fan?
Nobody cares about Harvard Crimson football, including probably the Harvard students. Alabama football is a different thing. Unfortunately, Alabama football is going through a bad spell right now. For 2 straight years, we haven't won a national championship.
Oh, no.
So at Alabama, that's kind of a bad spell. So, yeah, I'm a huge Crimson Tide fan.
That's great. Roll Tide.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, I mean, Harvard PhD, that qualifies you to be a bit of a brainiac, I would say, from my point of view. You've gone on to have a distinguished career in writing for a number of journals. You're an expert on capital punishment as well, which is interesting.
Yeah, I've written a good bit on capital punishment, yeah.
Fantastic. Now, the Marquette University, you had a long career there, then you had a bit of a hiccup recently regarding a compelled speech argument. Now, this is so poignant in the times we live in now. Are you able to speak about that?
Oh, sure. I've since 2005, had something called the Marquette Warrior blog, where I blogged about stuff. And sometimes I'd blog about national politics, but sometimes I'd blog about things going on at Marquette. And sometimes I would hang out some of Marquette's dirty laundry. Who was it? Felix Frankfurter, famous American jurist, who said, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Well, people who run universities don't exactly think like that. But anyway, what happened is one of my students came to me in 2014, and he'd been in a philosophy class, and the philosophy instructor had been talking about John Rawls' theory of equal liberty, blah, blah. And she briefly hit on gay marriage and said basically, well, I think that's right, meaning Rawls would approve of gay marriage. And this student was against gay marriage. And then after class, he went up to her and basically said, well, I would have liked to talk about gay marriage. He made it clear he was against gay marriage. Now, of course, she could have told him I didn't think that would be a good use of class time. If she'd done that, no harm, no foul. She's got to have a right to decide this is worth discussing, this isn't. But she didn't. She said, you're not allowed to make racist, sexist, and homophobic comments in my class. And then she asked, are there any homosexual students in the class? Well, he didn't know. She didn't know either. But she said, well, if there were, don't you think they'd be offended with you opposing gay marriage, which, of course, is a standard tactic in academia to try to shut up certain arguments. Well, you can't say that. It's offensive. So anyway, he was rather unhappy about that. He went to the department chair in philosophy, who basically just sort of blew him off, said, I forget exactly what she said, but the department chair, a woman named Nancy Snow, told the instructor, her name was Cheryl Abate, that, well, tell me if you have any more trouble with him, So he came to me, and I blogged about the whole thing. Now, he had a recording of the whole exchange, which, by the way, is perfectly legal in Wisconsin. It's a single-party consent state. So there was no question about what went down, and so I blogged about it. Okay. Well, I put a blog post up on a Sunday morning. Nothing much happened, but she, Cheryl Abate, went to a philosophy blog, a kind of left-leaning philosophy blog, and accused me of a politically motivated smear, notwithstanding that I was perfectly accurate about what she said. I had a recording. And that was published on that blog, which nobody much looks at, except a reporter for Inside Higher Ed, which is a website for academics. And that got picked up by a fellow named Todd Starnes of Fox News. And then it sort of went all over the place. Well, anyway, after it started going all over the place, she started getting some unkind, some rather nasty emails. Of course, I got some nasty emails too, although I don't think as many as she got. And she started, playing the victim, and Marquette said, well, you're at fault for these. You should not have mentioned her name, blah, blah. But of course, if you Google teacher made racist comments in class, or you could Google coach sexually assaulted team members, you'll find that in cases like that, the person accused of misconduct is always named in the story. And of course, I had no way of knowing it would go national. It largely went national because of Cheryl Abate's own efforts. So Marquette decided they were going to fire me because of that. Anyway, so I had a sort of a long legal battle about that. It finally went to the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which basically said, no, you can't fire McAdams. Now, important to understand that for public institutions in the U.S., the First Amendment applies, but not at private institutions, and Marquette's a private institution. On the other hand, most reputable private institutions guarantee faculty academic freedom.
Now, for the listeners, the oral judgment from Wisconsin Supreme Court is on YouTube, and it's fascinating to watch. But the point I wanted to bring into this, they wanted to give you the opportunity to be reinstated if you wrote a formal letter of apology.
Yeah. Let's be blunt. They're not that bright or that well educated about history, Demanding forced apologies is something that you would get in the Stalinist purge trials of the 1930s or the Cultural Revolution in China. They somehow didn't seem to know about that history or didn't seem to mind repeating it.
Yeah.
Anyway, Marquette faculty have contractually a guarantee of academic freedom, and that has two elements. One is in your own discipline, you have a right to write and teach in your own discipline your scholarly conclusions, all right? You can teach students what you think the correct interpretation of events or what the appropriate data is, and you can write that in articles. It also covers so-called extramural speech. That is when a faculty member comments on a matter of public interest in, an op-ed for the New York Times, or in my case, a blog post or a Facebook post. So both are elements of academic freedom, well established in American academia, and that's guaranteed to Marquette faculty by contract. The Supreme Court came down on my side on that, so I was reinstated, and I've been back for 3 semesters now teaching.
That's fantastic. I'm amazed that the circuit court somehow sided against you, but the oral judgment, it's just, totally fascinating, this whole issue about compelled speech. I mean, in your estimation as a professor, is there left-wing extremism throughout colleges? Is that increasing? It seems like in the media, that's all we hear about.
Well, I think there are 2 things going on here. Number one, yes. First of all, there have been polls of professors, and conservatives are disappearing from academia. It is part of something called the big sort. That is, places in society that lean left become more and more left. It also is the case that places that lean right tend to become more and more right. And academia, which has always leaned left, has become more and more leftist. Now, interestingly, Marxists are also disappearing from academia, except that's not particularly great because Marxists can be semi-sane in some ways. They're being replaced by postmodernists. And postmodernists are basically just flakes. They'll say there's no such thing as objective truth. And of course, they'll insist that that's an objective truth, that there's no such thing as objective truth. So anything you'll say, any claims you make, they'll say, well, that's just a tactic that people in power use to subjugate people. It's sort of a kind of cultural Marxism, which is rather different from the, old-fashioned, the proletariat's going to rise up type. But in academia, you first of all have the actively intolerant left, people who simply believe that ideas that they disapprove of should not even be heard. I guess the Brit term is deplatforming. That is, we're not going to give a platform to anybody who says something we don't like.
Yeah.
Or we've got to outlaw hate speech. But of course, it's always very selective. It's always hate coming from the political right that they want to outlaw. A hatred coming from the political left, they think is perfectly fine. So you have the zealots, who are probably a minority on any faculty, but then you have people who keep their heads down. Maybe they're somewhat sympathetic with the zealots, or maybe they just know the zealots are, in fact, zealots, and it could hurt your career if you cross them, if you in any way stand up for free speech. So when you put those two groups together and then add administrators, some of whom are hard leftists, probably a larger number are just bureaucrats who are sort of looking at the political landscape and asking, okay, what gives me a minimum amount of trouble if I go along with it? And those bureaucrats, of course, will go along with the politically correct zealots. So the situation of free speech in academia is not good. I don't know what's happened in Australia. I know there have been multiple cases in the U.S. of speakers being canceled or literally shouted down in U.S. colleges and universities. And a substantial number of U.S. college students, I think it was in the neighborhood of like 30%, believe that it's acceptable to use violence to shut up speakers whose views you consider to be evil.
I mean, it's happening here to a lesser degree. In Australia, everything always happens in a derivative nature, watered down sort of version. But I remember going to uni straight out of school, and, you know, it was a typical, the old style uni kids, you know, they were into left-wing politics because they were young and dumb, chaining themselves to trees and whatever. And now they're all bankers, you know, that type of thing when they're 40. They've got mortgages and investment properties. But now, the second time I went to uni as an older student, it was much more dangerous. There was a lot more trying to control speech, but nowhere near to the level of America.
Yeah.
Do you have genuine fears for college education? Because if it keeps going at this trajectory, there'll be a time when people would rather not hire a college-educated person.
It's possible. I mean, people, including conservatives and some old-style principled liberals, keep sort of looking for a backlash. I'm not sure exactly how that would happen. I mean, one problem is not simply the stifling of free speech. It's changes in the curriculum. On the one hand, making it more politically correct. We students at Marquette have to take a diversity course. That's defined as, you know, victim studies. You've got to study how this or that group has been a victim of the white, male, heterosexual, cisgender patriarchy. By the way, studying genuine diversity would be a very good thing. At Alabama, I took 2 courses in anthropology. Those are genuine diversity courses. Those are genuine courses about how, you know, different cultures have different mores and folkways and how different cultures work. Those are genuine diversity courses. Those aren't victim studies courses. And then a general watering down of the curriculum. At Marquette now, which claims to be a Catholic university, you can graduate with only 1 course in philosophy and 1 course in theology. So the watering down of the curriculum is a problem too. The politically correct types on college campuses are, in fact, victimizing minority students, notwithstanding that they think they are great advocates of diversity.
Well, that's the key issue, is the patronizing nature of the savior complex, isn't it? But I mean, more worrying than that is the shutting down of debate. I mean, this incident that you went through was all started by someone not wanting to debate an issue in a college campus, which is just insanity.
Yeah. Thank heavens for the Wisconsin Supreme Court. Yeah.
Now, thank you so much for all your wonderful insight. Can you leave us with a bit of advice? If you had to advise a budding conspiracy theorist.
Check things out, okay? Nothing wrong with reading conspiracy books. I mean, I have my students in my JFK assassination class watch the movie JFK. I warned them that it's not a documentary, but I just want to say, okay, this gets you immersed in the lore of the assassination, and we'll be discussing all semester what it is. So nothing wrong with exposing yourself to conspiracy books. Look at the other side. Look for logical contradictions among the different conspiracy arguments you're hearing. Always ask, how reliable is this evidence? if a woman comes forward claiming she was the girlfriend of Lee Oswald in the summer of 1963 in New Orleans, ask, okay, what's the evidence on that and how reliable is she? So take a skeptical view of this. And of course, in fairness, by all means, take a skeptical view of the Warren Commission and the Warren Commission report. Those people were not perfect, and the Warren Commission had its defects. So look at conspiracy literature, but look at the other side, particularly when you see some really juicy, apparent piece of conspiracy evidence. Ask, is that really true? And so check it out. And, Google is your friend. And, of course, my website is your friend, too.
Yeah, well, I'm going to leave all the links there. That's wonderful advice. Words to live by, I suggest. It'll save you 6 months of your life if you don't get involved in any of this rubbish, believing whatever you read. I implore everybody to go to Professor McAdams' website and just have a look around and search on the things you've heard about, and then you can see the actual facts and then make your own decision from there. Thank you once again for agreeing to do this. It's been a thrill for me. I've been reading you for a long time.
Well, I certainly enjoyed it. Thank you.
No problem at all. Have a good day.
Take care.